The crack of ice beneath her boots echoed through the mountain pass like gunfire, and Violet Lancaster knew if she didn't find shelter within the hour, the February storm would claim her body before spring thaw revealed her bones. She had been climbing for 3 days since fleeing the mining camp where her uncle had tried to sell her to the highest bidder among his gambling associates, men with yellowed teeth and cruel hands who looked at her like she was nothing more than a means to settle his debts. The year was 1872, and women without protection in the Nevada territory had few options, but death by freezing seemed preferable to the fate her uncle had arranged. The wind howled through the pines, driving needles of sleet against her face as she pressed forward, her threadbare coat doing little against the brutal cold that descended on the Sierra Nevada this time of year. Violet's fingers had gone numb hours ago, and her legs trembled with exhaustion as she forced herself up the steep incline. The sun was beginning its descent behind the peaks, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would not survive a night exposed to the elements. Her breath came in ragged gasps, creating clouds of vapor that disappeared instantly into the gray twilight. She had left Genoa, Nevada 3 days prior, with nothing but the clothes on her back and half a loaf of bread that was long gone. The desperation that had driven her into these mountains was the same desperation that now kept her moving when her body screamed for rest. Then she saw it. A dark opening in the rock face, partially obscured by a twisted juniper tree that clung to the mountainside. A cave. Salvation, or at least a temporary reprieve from the killing wind. Violet stumbled toward it, her vision blurring from cold and exhaustion. She nearly fell as she ducked under the low entrance, but the immediate absence of wind was such a relief that she wanted to weep. The cave extended back into darkness, and while it was still cold, it was at least dry and protected from the storm. Her survival instincts, honed by years of hardship after her parents' death, kicked in immediately. She needed fire. Violet ventured back out into the storm, gathering what dry wood she could find under the sheltering branches of trees, breaking off dead twigs and branches with her numb fingers. She made several trips, building a small pile near the cave entrance where the smoke could escape. Her hands shook violently as she pulled out the matches she had stolen from her uncle's cabin, precious matches that she had protected carefully during her flight. The first match broke. The second fizzled out in the dampness. Violet felt tears prick her eyes as she carefully struck the third, cupping it against the faint breeze that still reached into the cave mouth. The flame caught on a piece of dried bark, and she nearly sobbed with relief as she carefully fed the growing fire with twigs, then larger pieces of wood. The warmth was immediate and glorious, and she held her hands out to it, feeling painful tingles as blood began to flow back into her frozen fingers. She was so focused on the fire that she didn't hear the footsteps behind her, until a deep voice rumbled through the cave like distant thunder. "Well, I'll be damned!" Violet spun around with a gasp, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing at the back of the cave, emerging from shadows she had assumed were simply empty darkness, was the largest man she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the space. Long, dark hair fell past his shoulders, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, dark and intense, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He wore buckskin clothing and carried a rifle in one hand, though he held it casually, not pointed at her. "I'm sorry," Violet stammered, scrambling to her feet. Her legs nearly gave out and she caught herself against the cave wall. "I didn't know anyone lived here. I just needed shelter from the storm. I'll go." "Like hell you will," the man said, setting his rifle against the wall. "You'd be dead before you made it 100 yards in this weather." He moved closer, and Violet could see him more clearly in the firelight. His face was weathered and strong, his body thick with muscle beneath the buckskin. He looked like he had been carved from the mountain itself, solid and immovable. "How long have you been out in that storm?" "I don't know," Violet admitted, her teeth beginning to chatter now that the adrenaline was fading. "Days. I've been walking for days." The man studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes taking in her sodden clothing, her trembling frame, the desperation written across her face. Then he moved past her to the fire, adding more wood from a stack she hadn't noticed in the shadows. "Sit down before you fall down," he ordered, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You're half frozen." Violet hesitated, every instinct she had developed over the past weeks screaming at her to run. Men were dangerous. Men wanted to use her. But this man had already lowered his rifle, and he was building up her fire rather than putting it out. And truthfully, she didn't have the strength to run anymore. She sank down near the flames, unable to stop the violent shaking that had taken over her body. The man disappeared into the back of the cave and returned with a thick blanket made of animal pelts. He draped it around her shoulders without ceremony. "Name's Donovan Fischer," he said. "I trap in these mountains. This cave has been my winter shelter for 3 years now." "Violet Lancaster," she managed through chattering teeth. "I'm sorry for intruding on your home." Donovan grunted, settling himself on the opposite side of the fire. "You're running from something." It wasn't a question. Violet pulled the blanket tighter, debating how much to tell this stranger. But something in his direct gaze made her feel like lying would be pointless. "My uncle. He wanted to sell me to settle his gambling debts. I left before he could." "Smart woman," Donovan said, his expression darkening. "How long since you've eaten?" 2 days, Violet admitted. Donovan stood and moved to the back of the cave again. Violet realized now that the cave was deeper than she had initially thought, extending back into several chambers. He returned with dried meat and a water skin. "Eat slowly," he instructed, handing them to her. "Your stomach won't take it well if you gulp it down." The jerky was tough and salty, but it was the most delicious thing Violet had ever tasted. She forced herself to chew slowly, to take small bites, though every fiber of her being wanted to devour it all at once. Donovan watched her with an unreadable expression, occasionally adding wood to the fire. "Storm will last through the night," he said after a while. "Probably into tomorrow. You can stay here until it clears." "Thank you," Violet whispered. "I have no money to pay you." "Didn't ask for any," Donovan replied. "These mountains don't care about money. They'll kill you just the same whether your pockets are full or empty." He stood and began moving around the cave, and Violet realized he was preparing for the night. He set up what looked like a second sleeping area, using furs and blankets to create a pallet near the fire, but at a respectful distance from where she sat. "You take that side," he said, gesturing to a spot closer to the cave wall. "I'll sleep between you and the entrance. Nothing will get past me in the night." The casual protectiveness in his tone made something in Violet's chest tighten. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had considered her safety. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked quietly. Donovan paused in his work, his broad back to her. When he finally turned, his expression was serious. "Because someone should have been kind to you a long time ago, by the looks of it. And because these mountains are hard enough without people making them harder." He settled onto his own pallet, his large frame somehow fitting into the space with practiced ease. "Get some sleep, Miss Lancaster. You're safe here." Violet wanted to argue that she couldn't possibly sleep, that her nerves were too frayed, her situation too precarious. But the warmth of the fire, the fullness in her stomach, and the sheer exhaustion of 3 days running through the mountains overwhelmed her. She lay down on the pallet Donovan had prepared, pulling the furs around her, and was asleep within minutes. She woke several times during the night to the sound of wind howling outside the cave and the crackling of the fire. Each time, she could see Donovan's silhouette on the other side of the flames, sitting up and alert, keeping watch, protecting her. Each time, she drifted back to sleep feeling safer than she had in months. Morning came with weak sunlight filtering into the cave entrance. Violet sat up slowly, her body aching from days of hard travel and sleeping on stone, even cushioned by furs. The fire was still burning steadily, and she could smell something cooking. Donovan was crouched by the flames, tending to a small pot that hung over the fire on a makeshift stand. "Coffee," he said without turning around, "and some porridge, not fancy, but it's hot." Violet pushed the furs aside and moved closer to the fire, suddenly very aware of how terrible she must look. Her hair was a tangled mess, her dress was torn and stained, and she probably smelled like 3 days of desperate travel. But Donovan didn't seem to notice or care. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed her one, then spooned porridge into wooden bowls. They ate in silence for a while, and Violet found herself studying him in the daylight that now illuminated the cave. He was even larger than she had realized, his arms thick with muscle, his hands broad and calloused from hard work. But there was a gentleness in the way he moved, a carefulness that suggested he was very aware of his own strength and how it might intimidate others. "Storm's past," Donovan said eventually, gesturing toward the entrance. "But there's another one coming behind it. I can feel it in the air." Then I should leave while I can, Violet said, though the thought of going back out into the cold made her want to weep. Leave to go where? Donovan asked bluntly. You have a destination in mind, or were you just running? Violet set down her bowl, her appetite suddenly gone. I don't know, she admitted. I thought maybe I could make it to California, find work somewhere. But I didn't get very far. California's a long way off, especially this time of year, Donovan said, and a woman traveling alone. He shook his head. You wouldn't make it. Then what do you suggest? Violet asked, hearing the edge of desperation creep back into her voice. I can't go back. My uncle will find me if I stay in Genoa or any of the nearby towns, and I won't be his bargaining chip. Donovan was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, as if he was choosing each word carefully. Winter up here is hard. I could use help. Someone to keep the fire going, prepare food, maintain the camp while I run my trap lines. In exchange, you'd have shelter, food, and protection until spring. When the pass is clear, I could take you to Carson City. It's bigger than Genoa, easier to disappear. Might be work for a woman willing to earn her way. Violet stared at him, trying to process what he was offering. You want me to stay here, in this cave, with you? I'm not asking anything improper, Donovan said firmly, meeting her eyes. You'd have your own sleeping area. I won't touch you. But you need somewhere safe, and I could genuinely use the help. Winter trapping is brutal work, and I spend most days out in the cold. Coming back to a warm fire and hot food would be worth the extra supplies I'd need to feed 2 people. It was a practical arrangement, stated in practical terms. But Violet could hear what he wasn't saying, the offer of protection and safety that went beyond just a business transaction. Why would you do this for a stranger? She asked. Donovan's expression softened slightly. Because I know what it's like to have nowhere to go, he said quietly. My family died of fever when I was 17. I've been on my own ever since. These mountains, this life, it's hard and it's lonely. But at least I chose it. You didn't choose what happened to you. He stood, his tall frame unfolding with easy grace despite his size. Think about it. I need to check my trap lines before the next storm hits. I'll be back before dark. He gathered his supplies with efficient movements, slinging his rifle over his shoulder and tucking a hunting knife into his belt. At the cave entrance, he paused. There's food in the back chamber, more wood stacked along the wall. Fire stays lit no matter what. That's the most important thing up here. Then he was gone, disappearing into the white landscape beyond the cave. Violet sat by the fire for a long time after he left, her mind racing. She could leave now while he was gone, continue her flight to somewhere, anywhere. But to what end? He was right that she wouldn't survive the journey to California, especially in winter. And even if she made it to one of the closer towns, what then? She had no money, no skills that would earn her a respectable living. She would end up in the same desperate situation. Or worse. But staying here, alone with a strange man in the wilderness, was its own kind of risk. What if he was lying about his intentions? What if he expected more than he had said? Violet had learned the hard way that men's words and their actions often didn't align. Yet something in her gut told her that Donovan Fischer was exactly what he appeared to be. A solitary man who had made a life for himself in these brutal mountains, who understood hardship and survival, and who was offering her a chance at both. The way he had looked at her, direct and honest, without the leering hunger she had seen in her uncle's associates, the way he had given her his warmth and food without asking for anything in return, the way he had positioned himself between her and the cave entrance, protecting her while she slept. Violet stood and began exploring the cave more thoroughly. The main chamber where they had slept opened into 2 smaller chambers at the back. One was clearly Donovan's supply cache, with dried meat hanging from hooks driven into the stone, sacks of flour and beans, coffee, salt, and other essentials stacked along the walls. The other chamber had more furs, extra blankets, tools, and trapping equipment. Everything was organized with military precision, each item in its place. She returned to the main chamber and looked at the fire. Fire stays lit no matter what. She understood. The fire was life up here. Without it, the cold would creep in, deadly and inexorable. Violet fed more wood into the flames, then set about organizing the living space. She found a water skin and realized she would need to melt snow for fresh water. She located the cooking pot and began preparing more porridge, enough for when Donovan returned. The work felt good. It gave her hands something to do, her mind something to focus on besides her fear and uncertainty. As the day wore on and she continued to maintain the fire, prepare food, and organize the cave, Violet realized she had already made her decision. She would stay, at least until spring. It was the only choice that made sense. Donovan returned as the sun was setting, his broad shoulders dusted with fresh snow. He carried several rabbits and what looked like a marten, their pelts thick with winter fur. He nodded with apparent approval when he saw the fire burning strongly and smelled the food cooking. "Storm's coming faster than I thought," he said, hanging his catches on hooks and beginning the process of skinning them with practiced efficiency. "We'll be snowed in for a few days, most likely." "I'll stay," Violet said quietly. Donovan's hands paused in their work. He looked at her across the fire, his dark eyes searching her face. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Violet confirmed. "You're right that I have nowhere else to go. And if you truly need help, then this arrangement benefits us both. But I need your word that you'll keep your promise, that you won't—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "You have my word," Donovan said firmly. "You'll be safe here, Miss Lancaster. I swear it on my family's graves." The solemnity in his voice left no room for doubt. Violet nodded, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Then I'll do my best to be helpful. Though I should warn you, my cooking is adequate at best." The corner of Donovan's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. "Adequate is better than what I usually manage. And call me Donovan. If we're going to be sharing this cave for the next few months, we might as well dispense with formalities." "Then you should call me Violet," she replied. They fell into a routine over the following days as the storm raged outside. Donovan would wake before dawn, tend the fire, and prepare for the day's work. Even in the worst weather, he would venture out to check his trap lines, returning hours later covered in snow and ice, his face reddened by the cold. Violet would have the fire built up high, hot coffee waiting, and food prepared. She mended his clothing where it had torn, organized their supplies, and kept their living space as clean and comfortable as possible. They didn't talk much at first. Donovan seemed to be a man of few words, speaking only when necessary. But Violet found the silence comfortable rather than awkward. There was something peaceful about working alongside someone who didn't require constant conversation, who was content to simply exist in shared space. As days turned into weeks, however, they began to open up to each other in small ways. Donovan told her about his life in the mountains, how he had started trapping after his family died, and he had nothing left in the farming town where he had grown up. He talked about the animals he tracked, the changing seasons, the way the mountains transformed throughout the year. His voice, when he chose to use it, was deep and steady, and Violet found herself looking forward to their evening conversations by the fire. In turn, she told him about her life before fleeing to the mountains, how her parents had died when she was 15 in a cholera outbreak that swept through Virginia City, how her uncle had taken her in, more out of obligation than kindness, and put her to work in his boarding house. How he had grown increasingly desperate as his gambling debts mounted, until finally he had seen her as nothing more than an asset to be sold. "I'm 20 years old," Violet said one evening, staring into the flames. "I should have a life of my own by now, a future. Instead, I'm hiding in a cave in the mountains, dependent on the charity of a stranger." "You're not hiding," Donovan said firmly. "You're surviving. There's a difference." He poked at the fire with a long stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the cave ceiling. "And I'm 26. I've spent the last 9 years alone in these mountains. I never thought I'd share this space with anyone. But I'm glad you're here, Violet. It's good to have someone to talk to, someone who understands that life doesn't always go the way you plan." The honesty in his words made Violet's chest tighten. She looked at him across the fire, this massive, quiet man who had taken her in without question, who had given her safety when she had nothing. In the flickering light, his features seemed softer, less intimidating. She realized that she was starting to trust him, truly trust him, in a way she hadn't trusted anyone since her parents died. Winter deepened. The storms came and went, each one leaving fresh layers of snow that made the world outside the cave nearly impassable. During the worst weather, Donovan couldn't check his trap lines, and they would be confined to the cave together for days at a time. Violet had worried that the close quarters would become uncomfortable, but instead, she found herself enjoying his company more and more. She learned that Donovan had a dry sense of humor that emerged occasionally in unexpected moments. She discovered that despite his rough exterior, he was surprisingly well-read, with several precious books stored carefully in the back chamber that he would read by firelight in the evenings. She realized that his size and strength, which had initially frightened her, were paired with a remarkable gentleness. He moved carefully around her, always conscious of not crowding her or making her uncomfortable. One particularly cold night, when the wind howled outside like a living thing and the temperature in the cave dropped despite the roaring fire, Violet woke shivering. She had piled on every fur and blanket from her sleeping area, but the cold seemed to seep through everything. She saw Donovan sitting up on his own pallet, feeding more wood into the fire. "Can't sleep either?" he asked quietly. "Too cold," Violet admitted, her teeth chattering. Donovan was silent for a moment. Then he said carefully, "The best way to stay warm in cold like this is shared body heat. I know I promised I wouldn't touch you, and I'll keep that promise. But if you want to move your bedding closer to the fire, closer to where I'm sleeping, we'd both be warmer. I give you my word that's all it would be." Violet knew she should refuse, knew that sleeping close to a man, even one who had been nothing but honorable, was dangerous. But she was so cold, and she trusted him. Against all logic, against all her experience, she trusted Donovan Fischer completely. "All right," she said quietly. She gathered her furs and moved to the other side of the fire, arranging her bedding a respectful distance from his, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. They lay down, separated by a few feet of space, both staring at the cave ceiling. Thank you," Violet whispered, "for everything, for saving my life, for giving me a place to stay, for treating me with respect." "You don't need to thank me," Donovan replied, his deep voice rumbling in the darkness. "You've earned your keep 10 times over. This cave has never been cleaner or warmer. And I've never eaten so well, even if you insist your cooking is just adequate." Violet smiled despite her cold. "It is just adequate." "It's a damn sight better than mine," Donovan said. There was a pause. "Violet?" "Yes? I'm glad you found this cave. I'm glad you stayed." The simple honesty of the statement made Violet's heart skip. "I'm glad too," she whispered. They fell asleep like that, close but not touching, the fire crackling between them and the storm raging outside. And Violet felt safer, warmer, and more content than she had in years. As winter progressed, the dynamic between them shifted in subtle ways. They began to sit closer together by the fire in the evenings. Their conversations grew longer and more personal. Donovan started to smile more, the expression transforming his weathered face into something almost boyish. Violet caught herself watching him as he worked, admiring the play of muscles beneath his shirt, the capable grace of his large hands. She realized, somewhere in the long dark of February, that she was falling in love with him. The realization should have terrified her, but instead, it felt as natural as breathing. How could she not love him? This strong, gentle man who had given her everything and asked for nothing in return, who made her feel safe and valued, who looked at her like she mattered. But she didn't know if he felt the same way. Donovan remained respectful, maintaining the physical distance he had promised. He never gave any indication that he saw her as anything more than someone he was helping through a difficult time. And Violet, who had no experience with love or courtship, had no idea how to bridge that gap. One day in early March, Donovan returned from his trap lines with more than just catches. He had a wildflower, one of the first blooms of early spring, that he must have spotted on a south-facing slope where the snow had melted. He held it out to Violet awkwardly, his weathered cheeks slightly flushed. "Thought you might like to see something green," he said gruffly. "After all this white and gray." Violet took the flower, her fingers brushing his. The touch sent electricity up her arm. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Thank you, Donovan." They stood there for a long moment, closer than they had ever been, the small yellow flower between them. Donovan's dark eyes were intense, searching her face. Violet's heart pounded so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Violet," Donovan said, his voice rough, "I need to tell you something." What is it? She whispered. When the spring comes, when the pass is clear, I'll take you to Carson City like I promised. I'll make sure you have enough money to get started, find a place to stay, and work. You'll be free to start over, make whatever life you want. He paused, his jaw working. But I really hope that maybe you might consider staying. Staying? Violet repeated, barely breathing. When and he. With me, Donovan clarified. Here or wherever you want. I know I'm not much, just a mountain man with no property and no prospects beyond these trap lines. But I care about you, Violet. More than I've cared about anyone in a long time. These past months with you, they've been the best of my life, and I don't want them to end. Violet felt tears spring to her eyes. You care about me? I love you, Donovan said bluntly. I know I shouldn't. I know I have no right. You came here desperate, and I took advantage of that by asking you to stay, even if my intentions were good. But I can't help how I feel, and I won't trap you here. If you want to leave, I'll help you. But if there's any chance you might feel the same way, I'm asking you to stay, not as someone I'm helping, as my partner, my wife, if you'll have me. Your wife, Violet whispered. The word hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility. I know it's fast, Donovan said hurriedly. I know we've only known each other a few months. But up here, time moves differently. When you spend every day with someone, when you trust them with your life and they trust you with theirs, you get to know them better than most people do in years of courting in town. I know you, Violet Lancaster. I know you're strong and brave and kind. I know you sing quietly to yourself when you think I'm not listening. I know you're scared of thunder, but you pretend not to be. I know you've been hurt and you have every reason not to trust any man, especially one who found you alone and vulnerable. But I love you, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving that you can trust me if you'll give me the chance. Violet couldn't stop the tears now. They spilled down her cheeks as she looked up at this incredible man, this gentle giant who had saved her life and stolen her heart. I love you too, she said, her voice breaking. I've been trying not to, trying to be practical, but I can't help it. I love you, Donovan. I want to stay with you. I want to be your wife. The smile that broke across Donovan's face was like the sun rising over the mountains. He reached for her, then hesitated. Can I hold you? He asked. I've wanted to hold you for so long. Yes, Violet breathed. Please. Donovan's arms came around her, and it was like being enveloped in warmth and safety. He was so large that she felt small against him, but not diminished, protected, cherished. His hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers gentle in her hair. I'll take care of you, he murmured against her hair. For the rest of my life, I'll take care of you. And I'll take care of you, Violet replied, her arms wrapping around his broad back. We'll take care of each other. Donovan pulled back just enough to look down at her, his dark eyes full of wonder. Can I kiss you? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Violet nodded, rising on her toes to meet him. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, both of them learning each other. Then Donovan's arms tightened around her and Violet pressed closer, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of all the longing and loneliness they had both carried for so long. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Donovan rested his forehead against hers. We should do this properly, he said. Once the pass clears, we'll go to Genoa. We'll find a preacher and get married the right way. Then we'll come back here, or we'll go wherever you want to go. I'll build us a cabin, something more permanent than this cave. I have money saved. Not much, but enough to start. I don't need much, Violet said, her hand coming up to touch his bearded cheek. I just need you. They spent the rest of that day and evening wrapped in each other's arms, talking about the future they would build together. Donovan told her about a valley he had found years ago, a beautiful spot with a stream and good timber, where he had always thought he might build a home if he ever had reason to. Violet told him about her dream of having a garden, of growing flowers and vegetables, of creating beauty in the harsh mountain landscape. That night, they slept side by side for the first time, Donovan's large body curved protectively around Violet's smaller frame. She felt safe in a way she had never experienced before, loved in a way she had thought was only possible in stories. Spring came slowly to the mountains, but come it did. The snow began to melt in earnest, revealing the brown earth beneath. The stream that ran past the cave entrance, which had been frozen solid all winter, began to flow again. Birds returned, their songs filling the air, and with the changing season came the knowledge that their time in the cave was coming to an end. Donovan had been right about his savings. He had 3 years' worth of money from selling pelts, stored carefully in a leather pouch in the back chamber. It was enough to buy supplies for building a cabin, with some left over. They began to plan in earnest, discussing what they would need, how they would build their life together. In mid-April, when the pass had cleared enough for travel, they packed up what they would take with them and left the cave that had been their sanctuary through the winter. Donovan led Violet down the mountain on a different route than she had come up, one that was longer but safer, that brought them eventually to the trail that led to Genoa. The town was smaller than Violet remembered, just a collection of buildings clustered in the valley. She felt nervous as they walked down the main street, worried that someone might recognize her, that her uncle might be there. But Donovan's presence beside her, solid and reassuring, kept her fear at bay. They found the preacher at the small church on the edge of town. Reverend Thomas was an elderly man with kind eyes who asked them no questions about where they had come from or why they wanted to be married so quickly. He simply invited them into the church, called his wife to serve as a witness, and performed the ceremony with simple dignity. Violet had no fancy dress, only her cleanest homespun skirt and blouse. Donovan wore his buckskins, his long hair tied back, his beard neatly trimmed. They had no rings to exchange. But when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Donovan kissed her in that small church, Violet felt like the richest, most blessed woman in the world. They spent one night in Genoa, in a small boarding house where the proprietor asked no questions as long as they paid in advance. Donovan was gentle with Violet that night, patient and careful, understanding that while they had lived together for months, this was different. This was the beginning of their married life, and he wanted it to be right. Violet had been afraid, carrying the trauma of her near escape from a terrible fate, but Donovan's tenderness dissolved her fears. He made love to her like she was precious, like she was the most important thing in his world. And afterward, as they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Violet felt truly whole for the first time in her life. The next morning, they bought supplies with some of Donovan's money. Tools for building, seeds for planting, basic necessities that would make their new life easier. They hired a man with a wagon to transport the heavier items to the base of the trail that led to the valley Donovan had told her about. From there, they would have to carry everything themselves, making multiple trips over the next few weeks. The valley, when Violet finally saw it, was more beautiful than she had imagined. It nestled between 2 mountain ridges, protected from the worst winds, with a clear stream running through it and stands of pine providing timber. The meadow was already beginning to green up, and wildflowers dotted the grass. "It's perfect," Violet breathed, turning in a circle to take it all in. "Absolutely perfect." "I hoped you would think so," Donovan said, coming to stand behind her and wrap his arms around her waist. "This is where we'll build our life, Violet Fischer." The name still sounded strange to her ears, but wonderful. She was Violet Fischer now. She had a husband, a home, a future. She leaned back against Donovan's solid chest and watched the sunlight sparkle on the stream. They spent that entire spring and summer building their cabin. Donovan did the heavy work, felling trees and shaping logs, his powerful body moving with tireless energy. Violet helped where she could, but her main contribution was keeping them fed and organized, making sure they had what they needed when they needed it. She also began her garden, clearing a plot near where the cabin would stand and planting the seeds they had bought in Genoa. The work was hard, harder than anything Violet had done before. Her hands blistered and her back ached, and there were days when she wondered if they had been crazy to attempt this. But then Donovan would smile at her across the campfire they cooked on until the cabin was finished, or he would take her in his arms and dance with her in the meadow to music only they could hear. And she would remember why they were doing this. They were building something that was theirs, something that no one could take away from them. By August, the cabin was finished. It was simple but solid, with one large room that served as living space and sleeping quarters, a smaller room for storage, and a loft that could be used for additional space if needed. Donovan had built a large fireplace with river stones, remembering how important fire had been in the cave. He had made furniture from wood, including a real bed frame that he filled with pine boughs and covered with their furs. It was rustic, but it was home. Violet's garden had flourished in the mountain soil, and she spent her days tending it, harvesting vegetables, and learning to preserve food for the winter ahead. She also learned to help Donovan with the trap lines, checking the closer ones while he ranged farther afield. They worked as a team, each complementing the other's strengths. Their first year together passed in a blur of work and love and discovery. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's needs. They learned how to fight without hurting each other, how to apologize and forgive. They learned that sometimes words weren't necessary, that they could communicate in glances and touches. They learned what it meant to be partners in every sense of the word. In the fall of their second year together, Violet realized she was pregnant. She told Donovan one evening as they sat on the porch he had built onto the front of the cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. "I'm going to have a baby," she said simply. Donovan went very still beside her. Then he turned to look at her, his dark eyes wide. "A baby? You're sure?" "I'm sure," Violet confirmed. "Probably early spring." Donovan let out a whoop of joy that echoed across the valley and swept Violet into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. When he did, he immediately dropped to his knees and pressed his ear to her still flat stomach. "Can you hear anything?" Violet asked, amused. "Not yet," Donovan admitted, "but I will. I'll talk to him every day so he knows his father's voice." "Him?" Violet teased. "You're so sure it's a boy?" "Boy or girl, doesn't matter," Donovan said, standing and pulling her close. "As long as you're both healthy, you're going to need to take it easy. No heavy lifting, no long hikes." "Donovan, I'm pregnant, not dying," Violet protested. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "Not my wife," Donovan said firmly. "My wife is going to be careful and rest and let me take care of everything." Violet rolled her eyes, but secretly she was touched by his protectiveness. The next months were a lesson in patience for both of them. Donovan fretted constantly, convinced that any little thing might harm the baby. Violet grew increasingly frustrated with her changing body and her husband's overprotectiveness. But through it all, their love only deepened. In February, as a late winter storm raged outside their cabin, much like the one that had driven Violet to Donovan's cave 2 years earlier, Violet went into labor. Donovan had insisted they go to Genoa for the birth, but Violet had refused. This baby would be born in their home, in the valley they had built together. Donovan, for all his size and strength, was terrified, but he stayed by Violet's side through the long hours of labor, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, whispering encouragement. And when the baby finally came, a squalling, red-faced boy with a shock of dark hair, Donovan wept openly as he held his son for the first time. "He's perfect," Donovan whispered, his large hands cradling the infant with exquisite gentleness. "He's absolutely perfect." "He looks like you," Violet said weakly, exhausted but happy. "Poor kid," Donovan joked, but his eyes were full of wonder as he looked at his son. They named him Daniel, after Donovan's father. He was a healthy, strong baby with good lungs and his father's dark eyes. Donovan was instantly, completely besotted. Violet would wake in the night to feed Daniel and find Donovan already awake, watching over them both with an expression of such fierce love and protectiveness that it made her heart ache. Life with a baby was chaotic and exhausting, and more wonderful than Violet had imagined. She loved watching Donovan with their son, this huge mountain man cradling a tiny infant with such tenderness. She loved the quiet moments in the evening when they would sit together, Daniel asleep between them, and talk about the future. When Daniel was 2, Violet became pregnant again. This time it was a girl, born in the summer with her mother's eyes and a surprisingly loud cry for such a small thing. They named her Rose, after the wild roses that grew along the stream. Donovan was just as smitten with his daughter as he had been with his son, and Violet joked that he was going to spoil her rotten. The years flowed by like the stream that ran through their valley. Daniel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved to follow his father on trap lines. Rose was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, always getting into mischief. They added onto the cabin, building another room for the children. They expanded the garden, added a chicken coop, and eventually a small barn for the horse and cow they bought from a neighboring valley. Their life was not easy. The mountains were unforgiving, and there were hard times. a winter when game was scarce, and they had to carefully ration their supplies. A summer when sickness swept through the region, and they huddled in their valley, terrified it would reach them. A fall when Donovan was injured checking a trap, and Violet had to nurse him back to health while managing everything else. But through it all, they had each other, and that made everything bearable. When Daniel was 15 and Rose was 13, Violet became pregnant once more, much to everyone's surprise. She was 39 years old and had assumed her childbearing days were behind her. This pregnancy was harder than the others, her body not as resilient as it had been in her 20s. But in the spring of 1887, she delivered a healthy baby boy they named Thomas, after the preacher who had married them all those years ago in Genoa. Donovan, now 41 with silver threading through his dark hair and beard, held his youngest son with the same wonder he had held Daniel 15 years earlier. "I'm going to be an old man by the time this one's grown," he joked. "You're not old," Violet protested, though her own hair was showing gray now too. "Maybe not," Donovan agreed. "But I'm grateful. For all of it. For finding you in my cave that night. For every day since. You gave me a life I never thought I'd have, Violet." "We gave each other a life," Violet corrected, reaching up to touch his bearded cheek. "I was running and desperate with nowhere to go. You could have turned me away. But you made room for me. You made room for us." "Best decision I ever made," Donovan said, leaning down to kiss her gently. As Thomas grew, Daniel began to spend more time away from the valley, courting a girl from Genoa. Rose declared she wanted to be a teacher and began studying from books they acquired, determined to make her way in the world beyond the mountains. But they always came home, drawn back to the valley where they had grown up, to the cabin their parents had built with their own hands. Eventually, Daniel married his sweetheart and built his own cabin in the valley, not far from his parents. He took over more of the trap lines as Donovan aged, though the old mountain man refused to give up the work entirely. Rose did become a teacher, working in Genoa during the school year, but spending summers in the valley with her family. Thomas grew up the baby of the family, doted on by everyone, but he inherited his father's size and his mother's practical nature. He loved the valley and the mountains as much as Donovan did, and it was clear he would carry on the family tradition. One evening in the spring of 1902, Donovan and Violet sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset as they had done thousands of times before. They were both in their 50s now, their hair mostly gray, their faces lined by years of mountain living. But their love had not diminished with age. If anything, it had deepened, tempered by shared experiences and mutual respect. "Do you ever regret it?" Donovan asked suddenly. "Staying with me instead of going to Carson City, making a life in town?" Violet looked at him in surprise. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "Why would you ask that?" Donovan shrugged, his broad shoulders still powerful despite his age. "Sometimes I think about the life you could have had. Easier, more comfortable. You could have had a house in town, neighbors, society." "I have everything I need right here," Violet said, taking his hand. "I have a home. I have children and grandchildren. I have you. What more could I possibly want?" "I just want you to be happy," Donovan said quietly. "I am happy," Violet insisted. "Donovan, you saved my life that night 30 years ago, not just from the storm, but from everything. You gave me love and respect and a home and a family. You gave me a life worth living. I have been happy every single day I've spent with you." Donovan smiled, the expression still capable of making her heart skip, even after all these years. "I love you, Violet Fischer." "I love you too, Donovan Fischer," Violet replied. "Always have, always will." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. From inside the cabin, they could hear Thomas moving around, preparing dinner. From Daniel's cabin down the way, they could hear the laughter of their grandchildren. Violet thought back to that desperate, frightened girl who had climbed the mountain in a blizzard, seeking shelter in a cave she thought was empty. She thought about the mountain man who had found her there, who could have turned her away but instead made room for her in his life. She thought about all the years since, the struggles and triumphs, the love that had grown between them. She had fled to the mountains looking for survival, and she had found so much more. She had found home. She had found family. She had found love. And here, in this valley they had carved out of the wilderness, surrounded by the mountains that had brought them together, Violet knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. This was her life, her love, her legacy, and it was more than she had ever dared to dream. The years continued to pass in their valley. Donovan and Violet grew older, but their love remained strong. They watched their children and grandchildren flourish, building lives of their own while staying connected to the valley that was the heart of the Fisher family. In the evenings, Donovan would still hold Violet close, just as he had that first night when she had been too cold to sleep alone. They would reminisce about their journey from that fateful night in the cave to the life they had built together. Sometimes they would walk to the place where Donovan had built their cabin all those years ago, standing together and marveling at how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. Their story became legend in the region, the tale of the mountain man who found a desperate young woman in his cave and gave her not just shelter, but a life. People would ask how they had made it work, how they had built such a strong marriage in such difficult circumstances, and Donovan would always give the same answer. "I made room for two," he would say simply, "and she made it feel like home." Violet would add, "He gave me safety when I had none. He gave me love when I thought I was unlovable. He gave me everything." As they entered their 60s, their roles began to shift. Donovan, who had always been so strong and capable, began to slow down. His joints ached in the cold, and he couldn't range as far as he once had. But Violet was there, taking care of him as he had once taken care of her, proving that their partnership was truly equal. They would sit by the fire in their cabin, the same fire that Violet had built that first night in the cave, and Donovan would tell her again and again how grateful he was that the storm had driven her to his door, how finding her had been the best thing that ever happened to him, how loving her had given his life meaning, and Violet would remind him that he had saved her in every way a person could be saved, that his love had healed wounds she didn't even know she had, that being his wife had been the greatest honor of her life. Their grandchildren grew up hearing the story, the romance of it capturing their imaginations. They would ask their grandmother to tell them again about the night she climbed the mountain in the blizzard. They would ask their grandfather about finding someone in his cave, about deciding to let her stay. And Donovan and Violet would tell the story together, each adding details the other forgot, their voices blending in the familiar rhythm of a tale told many times. But it never got old, because it was their story. The story of how two lonely, hurting people found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built something beautiful from their shared desperation and hope. In the winter of 1910, on a cold February night, much like the one when they had first met, Donovan and Violet lay together in the bed he had built for her nearly 40 years earlier. They were both elderly now, both showing the wear of a hard life in the mountains, but they were still together, still in love, still grateful for every day they had been given. "Do you remember that first night?" Violet asked softly, her head resting on Donovan's chest. "When you found me in the cave?" "I remember everything about you," Donovan replied, his voice still deep despite his age. "I remember thinking you were the bravest woman I'd ever seen, half frozen and terrified, but you were building a fire, trying to survive. I knew right then you were special." "I thought you were going to throw me out," Violet admitted. "I was so scared." "I was scared too," Donovan confessed. "Scared of what it meant having someone else in my space, scared of the responsibility, but more scared of what would happen to you if I didn't help. I couldn't let you die out there, Violet, and once I got to know you, I couldn't let you leave." "I'm glad you didn't," Violet said. "I'm glad you made room for two." "Best decision I ever made," Donovan repeated, the same words he had said so many times over the years. "You've made every day of my life better, Violet, every single day." They fell asleep like that, holding each other as they had done for nearly 40 years, warm and safe in the home they had built together. And in the morning, they woke together, ready to face another day in their valley, grateful for the love that had sustained them through everything. Their children and grandchildren visited often, bringing news from the changing world beyond the mountains. But Donovan and Violet were content in their valley, in the life they had created. They didn't need anything more than what they had, each other and the family they had built, and the mountains that had brought them together. As spring came once more to the valley, bringing with it the wildflowers that Violet loved, they walked together along the stream, their steps slower than they once were, but no less sure. Donovan still held Violet's hand, still looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. 40 years, Violet marveled. Can you believe it's been 40 years since I stumbled into your cave? Seems like yesterday, Donovan said, and also like forever. I can barely remember what my life was like before you. Lonely, Violet suggested. Very lonely, Donovan agreed. I didn't even realize how lonely until you showed up and filled all those empty spaces I didn't know I had. They stood together at the edge of the meadow, looking back at their cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying with it the smell of the bread Violet had baked that morning. Daniel's cabin was visible through the trees, and they could hear the distant shouts of their grandchildren playing. We did good, didn't we? Violet asked. We did better than good, Donovan said, pulling her close. We did extraordinary. And there, in the valley they had claimed as their own, surrounded by the evidence of their love and partnership, Donovan and Violet Fischer stood together, still in love after 40 years, still grateful for the storm that had driven a desperate woman to a mountain man's cave, and for the choice he had made to make room for two. Their story would be passed down through generations, a testament to the power of compassion and love, of two people choosing each other every day despite hardship and challenge. It was a story of survival and hope, of finding home in the most unexpected place, of building something lasting from nothing but determination and love. And it all began on a cold winter night in 1872, when mountain man Donovan Fischer found Violet Lancaster building a fire in his cave. She had nowhere else to go, and he made room for two. From that simple act of kindness grew a love story that would endure through the decades, a love that would create a family and a legacy, a love that proved that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected encounters. As the sun set over the valley once more, Donovan and Violet returned to their cabin, walking hand in hand, still partners, still best friends, still deeply, completely in love. And they knew, as they had known every day since that first night in the cave, that they were exactly where they were meant to be, together.